Why do soldiers and service members have mental health issues? And I'm not saying it's all based on leadership, but I'm pretty sure that you could correlate most of these issues with poor leaders. And why do people get out of the military? It's because they had one bad leader. And that's all it takes. It just takes one bad leader that has transitional leadership practices to set a soldier down that path of darkness.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Joshua McMillion. He is a father, a servant leader, and a combat veteran with over 15 years of leadership experience and the recipient of the 2018 General Douglas MacArthur Leadership Award. He currently serves in Army Acquisitions as an Assistant Product Manager, APM, for PEO Aviation, and he loves his job. He's intensely focused on excelling as a servant leader in the Army and helping foster a coaching culture. He is a certified Army leadership coach, helping build more purposeful, accountable leaders through one-on-one coaching. Joshua, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny too, because now I'm in the hot seat, right? So I had you on my podcast earlier and I got to ask all the questions and share the story. And now I'm in the hot seat of where you could ask me any question and I have to share my story. So it's an honor to be on here. Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. And swapping podcasts is so much fun to me because I feel like you always get a different perspective of the other person because podcasts are slightly tailored differently. But I'd love to just hear more about your story if you don't mind sharing with the audience.
Yeah, I think I thought about this of being like one of the first podcasts that I've been on. What do I want to leave your listeners with? And I think if I could sum it up into one word, I would like to kind of clearly define what leadership is, at least through my lens. But in order for me to provide the definition of what leadership is, I want to share some of the major stories that I've had throughout my life that's really helped bound that into a clear definition of where I am today. So who am I? I am from a rural part of West Virginia. So Fenwick, West Virginia, my high school had, I think, 100 people in it. My football team had 18. So I come from a very humble upbringing. And we were talking about this on the last podcast of where you were on my show, is that leaders aren't born, they're created by life experiences. And that's so true, especially with me. When I was growing up in grade school, I had all these labels that were placed against me. I was dyslexic, so I was placed in special needs classes. I was overweight to the point of where I literally could not go to my grandparents on the weekend because of the food I got. And I had all these different labels that were placed against me. And I never had the confidence of actually being able to become a leader in my own right and build it until I started getting into sports. When I got into sports in sixth grade is really where the spark started to happen, of where I started to build confidence in my own life. And around that same time too, I kind of had almost like a divine moment of where I had my tonsils removed. And it was an experimental surgery at the time of where instead of sewing it up, they actually did laser sutures. And about 2 weeks into that, my sutures opened up while I was sleeping. And instead of me just hemorrhaging blood, my grandfather, which was passed away about 2 years before that, woke me up in my dream vividly telling, "Hey, Josh, you need to wake up." And I woke up and I started throwing up blood and I lost almost a third of my blood. It was absolutely insane. But at a very young age, I learned how precious life was, and that how I go back to my strength statement that every day is a gift. I'm not going to waste mine. And I had that kind of motto going through junior high, starting to play sports, getting selected for all the different team captains positions, starting to lose the weight. And then the last hurdle that I really had to overcome when I was in the informative years of my life was breaking the label of dyslexia and all those different academics that people gave upon me. So I remember vividly when I was in the ninth grade that my science teacher gave me cassette books instead of an actual textbook because she didn't think I could read it. And how that lit such a burning desire inside of me to prove people wrong and start to chase hard things. And ever since that point in my life, I went from B's probably to straight A's for the rest of high school and then all the way through college, and then ultimately kind of being a pathfinder. So in high school, I really came into my own in terms of leadership. And I was always selected for being team captain, even when I wasn't a senior. And I couldn't really put a pinprick on why that was until now. It's because of the maturity that I had in those informative years. And I remember one of my coaches, I'll leave the name out, right before a major game, all the teams were in there and they were just going crazy, doing like a bunch of crazy celebrations. And then there I am. I'm intensely focused on what I needed to do and then preparing on what was I going to say as a team captain before we go out to the tunnel, because I wanted them to start to understand, hey, this is one of the last games that I'm going to have, but also too, how can you chase significance and not just success? And he went up to me, he's like, Josh, I've always looked up to you from a standpoint is that you're a man among boys. And I never really dawned on me until recently when I started like digging into leadership and understanding that my maturity has kind of always set me apart. But that goes back to, I think, where I almost died at a very young age and learning humility at a very young age. So kind of fast forward into my college days, I figure out a way to go to college. So my dad's a coal miner. I'm the first person in my family to ever go to college. So I kind of just like stumbled into it. I had no idea that you had to take an ACT. I had no idea that you had to take any kind of standardized test to go to school. I just winged it. I went there and I took a standardized test where I got like a 17 on the ACT, and I had to do community college for a semester just to prove that I could get good grades. But I was finally able to do that. And then I had to figure out how to pay for college. So that was the next hurdle that I had to overcome. And my dad was a coal miner and his dad was a coal miner. So we didn't have any real money to pay for it. And I remember my dad asking me how we were going to pay for this when we got for our first bill. And I looked at him and was like, Dad, I have no idea. But I promise you, if you help me pay for this, you won't regret it. And I remember having that conversation with my father and him taking the time and figuring out a way to pay for this. And then mind you, this was at a time where my mom and dad got a divorce and they were $60,000 in credit card debt. And I love my mom intensely, and there's nothing ill that I would ever say about her. But my dad sacrificed so much for me at a pivotal point in my life, of where we always talk about if you're planted or if you're buried. But if you're planted and you can sow a seed and let it mature over time, it's going to bear more fruit for not just you, my dad, not just me, myself, but everyone around me. And that was such a pivotal moment in my career for my dad kind of investing in me. And then it gave me a burning desire with that same theme of maturity going through college, of being focused on grades. When everyone was going out, they were getting drinks and they were going having parties, I was focused on getting good grades. I was focused on doing extracurricular activities and trying to excel as much as I could in school, but I always missed something. And that something was being a servant leader. And I never truly understood yet what my passion was in my life or what my purpose was, but I knew that I was missing something. It was a greater calling of duty. And then I looked at ROTC. So I knew that ROTC around my junior year was something that I wanted to do. And I joined the National Guard through the simultaneous membership program. But the reason that I joined was not for school, not for money, anything like that, but it was a sense of duty that I wanted to give back to a country that has given me so much at that time in my life. And I went to several different leadership schools, and I started to notice a theme is that I was always selected for leaders of influence when I was a cadet. You know, when I was an MS-13, I was selected to be the platoon leader all year. And when I was a MS 14 or MS 4, which is a senior in college, I was the cadet battalion commander. So I was in charge of Marshall University's ROTC program, and I was training and resource management for over 77 cadets. And I ended up winning the George C. Marshall Leadership Award, which was no small feat, but it never landed on me of how significant that was at the time. Kind of fast forward through my college years, I started looking at what branch I wanted to go to and where I wanted to go lead. So I knew I wanted to be a infantryman. That was the only branch that I was head and heart aligned with. So I'll say that a lot, but what I mean is that I can see it, me doing it, and I'm emotionally aligned to it. And if my head and my heart is aligned, then my hands are just naturally going to be aligned to that task. So I started figuring out, okay, what do I need to do on the order of merit list to get the branch choice that I want and then the duty station that I want. And I ended up getting the branch choice that I wanted, and I ended up getting the duty station that I wanted of going to Fort Lewis, Washington. And we were there for probably a month before we deployed to Afghanistan. But before I even had to get my first platoon in combat, I had to go to Fort Benning, Georgia. So when I was at Fort Benning, Georgia for almost a year, which is absolutely crazy to think about it now that I was at Fort Benning for almost a year doing airborne school, ranger school, infantry officer basic school, mortar leader course, all these different schools that I had to do to just get my first platoon. And there was a lot of like really good leadership nuggets that I had from those years. When I was in IBOLC, I had the opportunity to continue to kind of bound down my leadership abilities from a tactical level. So through IBOLC, you kind of learn the maneuver side from platoon tactics. And it's a 16-week course. And at that time, about 12 weeks was in the actual field, not in a classroom setting. And then I transitioned into Ranger School. Ranger School, if you've ever heard of that school, is not necessarily difficult. You're not doing anything that is mind-boggling or like physically demanding to the point of where it's almost supernatural. But one of the biggest things that I had to learn to do is to lead myself when I am physically and mentally at a point of where my body is screaming at me to stop. And it's because of food and sleep deprivation. Where you're walking in the hills of Dahlonega, Georgia, and you're carrying a 120-pound rucksack and you're burning 14,000 calories a day, but you're only eating 2,000 calories, eventually something's going to give. And usually what that is, in most people, is your mind. With me, I was always able to push past those moments. And there was a time in Ranger School when we were in the first phase, and that was in Darby at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I had to actually get removed from my squad because I was the only survivor in my squad. Every single person, to include my RI, Ranger instructor, had a heat injury. So it was super hot. It was like 110 degrees in Fort Benning, Georgia in the summer. And we just went on this really brutal mission set probably towards the end of that phase. And everyone was already sleep deprived. They were already food deprived. And they were just falling like flies. And then eventually the RI ended up falling out. And I had to move to another squad. And I started to learn quickly that mentally I can push far beyond what my body thinks is capable. And then also in that school, I had to learn how to lead other people who are at that depleted state, not just mentally, but physically, of just beaten down to a point of where you're so tired that you can't even think straight, that you literally hallucinate. There's so many stories of friends of mine that are in Ranger School that eat pine cones because they think it's an actual MRE, or they're walking and just dragging their weapons. And there's a funny thing about Ranger School is you have to tie everything down to yourself. Your weapon has to get tied to you. Your knife has to get tied to you. And there's a reason, is because at some point you're going to fall asleep walking. And I didn't think it was possible until I got yelled at in Florida one night from a Ranger instructor telling me, what are you doing right now, Ranger? And I looked at him, and my platoon was about 1,000 meters in front of me, but I could barely see them crossing a field. And I was just sleeping, walking, which I had no idea was an actual thing, but it is. But I had say all that because I learned a lot about who I was before I had to actually take over a platoon. So I go to Fort Lewis, Washington after those informative life lessons at Fort Benning, Georgia, married to the love of my life. We have about a month before we get ready to deploy. And at this moment in my life, it was everything that I've ever wanted. I always wanted to lead soldiers in combat. And if you ever watched the movie We Were Soldiers, where they have all those different platoon leaders that are going through the training exercises up to that moment of leaving for battle, the best way to define me was that platoon leader that wanted to chase awards. I was very selfish from the mindset of that. I wanted to go into a leadership position, not to add value to people, but to add value to myself so I could go chase those aspirational life goals that I wanted. I wanted to go be a Ranger Regiment platoon leader. I wanted to go to Delta Force and try out for all these cool things. And then life has a way of humbling you. And I'm blessed from the standpoint that I was humbled at a very young age in my career. When I was 23, right before I took over my platoon, I had to attend a memorial service in Afghanistan. I'll leave his name out, for a soldier in my platoon. The first interaction that I had with my platoon sergeant and the squad leader and the different command teams within the organization that I was going to go lead under was at this memorial service. And then just listening to the company commander break down, and I've never before in my life seen a leader who had that level of influence be so emotionally distraught that you can't come to words. And then just allowing that to kind of settle into the room. And then it dawned on me that, wow, how selfish am I going into this position with an agenda of trying to get something out of it so I could push to something higher. And at that moment, I stopped myself from thinking selfishly. And I've carried that for the rest of my life. And I went through that entire deployment thinking, okay, how can I add value to my team? And how can I make this experience worthwhile for the organization and ultimately bring everyone back home safely, which I was blessed to do. But our deployment in RC South Afghanistan, which is right around Panjwai, Helmand, was fairly rough for a lot of my peers that we had. And so one of my stories, when I was in IBOLIC, I had a sister company commander. We'll just use his nickname Flip, but he was a mentor of mine. And the crazy thing about IBOLIC in the unit that I went to is my small group instructor, which was a staff sergeant at the time, was one of my staff sergeants when I took over a platoon in Afghanistan. And to know how small of a world that is absolutely mind-boggling, because this individual knew exactly who I was before I took over the platoon. They knew what my faults were going to be before I took over. And they were able to mentor me in such a deep way to help me realize my weaknesses and my strengths. But the senior company commander that we had, or a sister company commander that we had, was in the same battalion as me. And one of the missions that he went on after taking over his company command, he stepped outside of the perimeter that we're setting for IEDs. So where we were, it's a really big IED threat. Out of a lot of small arms fire engagements, that was a big enemy threat. But the biggest one was the ability to not maneuver. So in RC South, because it's so flat, the biggest issue that you have is just the IED threats. And because of that, you have to use baby powder to mark your lines. So we would be out with mine hounds and we would be doing detections, and we would have baby powder to line a straight line for a file for everyone to walk through. And then at the time, he stepped out just 6 inches. over that baby powder and hit an IED. He lost both of his legs. He lost one of his arms and some other, vital parts. And to me, I looked up to him. And that was hard for me, but it was even harder for some of my peers who had to kind of experience that. And the remainder of our deployment, I think I lost count on the number of amputees between us and 82nd that they had, but I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of upper 70s. And then we had 5 KIAs. In terms of other combat deployments that I know some of my friends have been on, that's pretty tame when it comes to, killed in action. But in my mind, one soldier is too much. And I went to that mindset of having that humbling experience and then being able to, while I was in Afghanistan, kind of have what I like to call a servant's heart, or lead with hugs. So humility, understanding, gratitude, and having a servant heart, and just being there. And one of the stories that still sticks out to me this day was one of the very first firefights that we've ever gotten into. So a mission came down when I probably just took over my platoon. I would say I was about a week into just being the brand new platoon leader for this organization. And this was probably, I would say, a month after the soldier that passed away at the memorial service. I attended his memorial. Well, where we were going to be going back into the village that he passed away in. And a lot of the platoon was very hesitant against that. And to make matters even worse, we were embedded with our Afghan platoon counterparts. And one of the hardest things at that time, and I still remember vividly to this day, is that they were separated. They didn't work together. The Afghan army did their own thing, and the army did their own thing, but we never truly worked together. We never synergized. Even when we had platoon cops, they were broken up between Afghan and they were broken up between army. So we get this mission to come down, and I'm going through all the different mission plannings that we can have, and everything goes beautiful. It's almost picturesque of how this went in a morbid kind of way. The best that an infantryman could have a morbid story about is that we found 76 different IEDs. We never hit a single one. We were able to find them beforehand and get them before they hit any of our soldiers or any of our vehicles. We had several different large firefight engagements, and this was right during Ramadan. But right before that, what I wanted to try to do was build a relationship with my Afghan counterpart so deep that there was no ill will towards their team and our team. And one of the biggest issues at that time was green on blue attacks. So green on blue being, just Afghan soldiers being infiltrated by Taliban and doing attacks on American and NATO forces. So what I wanted to do is everything in my power to build those relationships. So every day, this was during Ramadan in July, in the middle of Afghanistan, the summer. So it's not exactly, I would say, cool, right? It's probably like 120 degrees. Every day I was focused on practicing their fasting. And I didn't stick to it 100% because I just couldn't do it. But I honored their traditions that they had. And I would spend every hour a day of learning Pashto and Dari with my counterpart, Balul. And I would teach him English. And just that small gesture of being and spending authentic time with my counterpart built such a deep relationship of where we got ready to leave. He refused to work with any other American force. Like, I had to pull teeth of where I had to actually go there and talk to him and be like, hey, this is a good American unit, and he has your best interest at heart. And that was a very important lesson that I learned, is that it doesn't matter what kind of cultural divide you have. If you're coming into a team or if you're coming into a new position, the most important thing that you can do is building authentic relationships. But I have so many other war stories, and if you want to dig into those, we can, but kind of quickly transitioning outside of Afghanistan, which was very informative to me, and it really set the framework of who I am as a leader. And I kind of defined that as my house of leadership. I transitioned to my company grade time. So I get promoted to a company commander. I take over my first assignment in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I know you're in the Navy. I don't know if you've ever heard the term Fort Polk, Louisiana, and how negative condensation that place has. So it's known as the armpit of the Army. It's probably the most undesirable location. But I will say this: if anyone's listening, and you're going to Fort Polk or you are at Fort Polk, it was one of the most beautiful experiences that I've ever had in my life. Not just for my family. Yeah, the location is not ideal. If you ever watch Brother, Where Art Thou? It's a geographic anomaly. It's 45 minutes away from everything, but the Army has a way of doing that, building installations that are 45 minutes away from everything. But I credit that time of being able to connect my passion of finding what that truly is in my life. So the first assignment that I went to, I was an observer coach trainer. They call those OCTs. And there's 3 different CTC rotations that the Army has. There's one at Hollenfels, Germany, which is a combat training command. There's one at the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California, and that's not ideal. I hate that one the most. And then there's the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Polk, Louisiana. And the whole purpose of these is to take brigade size forces through a realistic combat deployment. And the intent is to train like you're going to fight and to make the conditions so realistic. So when you do go to war, it's something that you've already experienced, and it's actually easier realistically what you experienced at these CTC rotations. And I was given a position of being an observer coach trainer or an OCT for a platoon, and then ultimately the honor to be able to take over a company. And I did over 26 rotations through these month-long training exercises of where I'm observing my counterparts, I'm coaching them on Army doctrine and what they need to do, and helping train them to become better so they could go down range and they could do their job with the ultimate goal of taking their men and women back safely. And it really brought such a light into my life that I discovered I loved coaching. I loved working with people. I loved adding value to people. And that was the best job that I had. I think also the reason it was the best job that I had is that they gave me keys to a Humvee. And I always joke that the Army messed up when they gave a captain keys to a Humvee. But that was fun. And then I transitioned quickly to brigade staff, of where I had to go do a mission planning, a brigade level training exercise for over 7,000 soldiers for their own CTC rotation. And I'm not naive. I was selected for that job based on my experience, but I had to learn quickly how to influence people that I do not have direct authority over to gain momentum and start chasing these big goals. And then after that short period of time, I was able to take over my first company command. So it was a rifle company command, and the brigade was getting ready to deploy to Iraq. Our company was tasked with the Be Prepared to Deploy mission. So our company was not deploying. We were a CENTCOM asset. We were a strategic reserve for the brigade. So if they needed an additional combat power, we would go and we would wherever the Army needed us, whether that be, Africa or wherever. In my company command time, I was able to use a lot of the lessons that I got from the CTC rotation to do a pretty good job. And I had a lot of freedom to just do whatever I wanted in terms of planning and mission prepping, because I had no, what they call in the Army, mission essential task lists from higher, because they were all deployed. And I was able to kind of formulate that vision for our company. And then I had a couple tragic accidents that happened in my company command time, and that really shook me to my core. So it's easy to justify when you lose a soldier in combat, right? Because we're all signed up for combat, and you know that you're putting your life on the line of doing dangerous things in dangerous places, and there's dangerous people that are trying to hurt you. But when you lose a soldier to completely preventable issues, it stains your soul in such a way that it affects it for a long period of time. And my first loss was, I won't say his name, was a completely preventable accident of a car accident after a training exercise. And I'll always remember the last words I had with a soldier as we were doing air assault operations at a platoon level. And I was just berating them because I was giving him an after action review at an AAR, and he was a team leader, but he was such a junior team leader. He was a specialist getting ready to be a sergeant. And I saw greatness in him, but I saw greatness in him too, because he was from rural West Virginia, an area that I grew up in. And I had several people in my platoon that were from rural West Virginia. And that first loss, was hard on me, but I tried to go through it as professionally as possible, especially for the family. So I don't know if the Navy probably does the same way as the Army did, but when you lose a soldier, it's a very scripted set of events, from a casualty affairs officer to a casualty notification officer, and a beautiful kind of ceremony that they get to do for the family. And my goal was to try and do that in such a professional manner to where it would try to ease as much as it possibly could the burden of losing a son, which, I mean, I don't think you can do, but I tried to do it the best that I possibly could. And that's when I learned one of my weaknesses is that I'm an emotional dude. Before that time, like, I would not cry, especially when I was a platoon leader. Up to that point, my dad never cried. But for whatever reason, that moment just unlocked in me, I think it was a purpose that I had in life, is being able to add value to people. And where I felt that I failed him in such a way that it created, I remember telling my company that morning when it happened, because you have to break the news to your organization, of just breaking down and crying, and my first sergeant coming over and getting ready to pull me out. And I'm like, nope. And then I harnessed it and I was able to complete that message. But fast forward about 3 months later, I'm in Iraq. I'm getting ready to take over another company command, and this is a HHC company command. So you're bumping up the numbers to 250 people that I'll be leading now. I'll have over $120 million of equipment that I'm going to be managing. And as I'm doing these change of command inventories, I get another CCIR. I can't remember what the CCIR stand for right now, Commander's Critical Information Requirements. And usually those happen when bad things happen. And number 6 is the one that you never want to get, because that means it's a death of a soldier. And it happens again. I get another CCIR, and it's another soldier that's from rural West Virginia. And I start reflecting on, am I cursed? Throughout my entire life, even in high school, most of my friends that I know nowadays have either committed suicide. A lot of soldiers that I've had in the past have committed suicide, not necessarily in my formation, but in the formation that I've led in the bigger battalion. And I've lost soldiers in combat, and I've lost soldiers in command. And that one really struck me, is that I felt like I was cursed in a way, that death was following me. And as a leader, I needed to do better. And I'm at a very low point in my career, and someone just gets selected for a second company command. You think, hey, you should be on a high. But personally, I took it very hard that, hey, I'm not the best person that I can be as a leader, and I need to really figure out who I am. And then I started a self-discovery journey of when I was in company command my second time, but really when I began to transition out into where I'm at in acquisitions. When I was in HHC, I had a blessing to have a great counterpart as a non-commissioned officer, and he really helped me put back on track of what's truly important and being able to focus on soldiers and their families. One thing that I absolutely loved when I was in command was my ability to run the FRG program, Family Readiness Group. And I took it as a point of pride to not just use that as a rubber stamp program that the commander has to do one thing a month, but to make it a fun activity of going paintball competitions or going to these huge Toledo Bend trips with free pontoon rentals for families, and try to create a family atmosphere. And I tried to do it as much as I possibly could. And my company command combined with me getting selected from my leadership to go compete for, and I had no idea what this was. I was actually irritated that they wanted me to go do this. And I go to ForceCom to do the General Douglas MacArthur Leadership Award boards and then go through their selection process. And then I start really reading into who General Douglas MacArthur was, reading in his bio and learning about him. And one of the stories sticks out to me is, I think, Corregidor, where he lost a pretty decisive battle to Japan. And I was trying to formulate in my mind, how we talked about this earlier today, that only you can label failure a failure. He loses almost his entire unit to Japanese forces, has to flee that island at night, and then ultimately comes back 6 months later with the Pacific Fleet, defeats the Japanese and frees the Philippine army. And it kind of goes back to the point of that, hey, only you can get in your head and only you can label failure. So I start learning about who he was as a leader and start learning about the legacy of this award, and find that only 14 captains a year out of the eligible pool in the Army, which is over 100,000, get selected for this. And it's such a rigorous process of where you have to go through your battalion, nominate you, and it's not something you can nominate yourself for. And then that goes to your brigade. And then your brigade selects the best one to go forward to your division. And then for the 10th Mountain Infantry Division, I was their selectee. And then it gets sent up to the Army or the COCOM, so ForceCom. And then the ForceCom goes to the HQDA level at the Pentagon, and they select their best 14 from there. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I have been incredibly hard on myself through both of my company commands, thinking that I've been doing a absolutely horrible job. And someone thinks that I've been doing the opposite of that, and that me going to these competitions, I was able to be authentic in a way to where I think a lot of other people weren't. And that's what separated me, ultimately able to win, especially when I was going in boards, because I clearly knew what my passion was. My passion was waking up every day and trying to make soldiers' lives better, of trying to add value to people and be a light bringer. So in a dark room, I wanted to hold the flashlight and I wanted to shine a path for people and try and make it a better day. But then I started to discover my purpose, and my purpose is I'm placed on this earth to be a coach. And I'm placed on here to help people discover who they are and become a better version of themselves. And when I was going through that competition and when I ultimately won it, it was actually an amazing, deeply humbling experience. And it still is to this day. And I got old bronze head back there that I always use when I'm going through my self-reflection morning meditations. And I look at that with all the plaques and stuff that I've gotten, and it centers me, because I remember at the lowest point in my career was one of my highest points. And that was such a deeply rewarding moment in my time. And then I transitioned into Army acquisitions. So I made the choice to move from infantry to Army acquisitions after I was doing a 12-mile ruck march with some of my scout platoon. We were on our way back and my knee locked up and then my back locked up. And then I'm sitting there and I'm watching all these youngsters go by me, and I'd be like, I can't physically do this anymore. And I asked myself a question is, are you willing to ask other people to do things physically that you can no longer do yourself? And I've always prided myself of being extremely physically fit. And I'm like, no, the moment that and I made this rule to myself, I don't love what I do, or I can't do what I tell others to do, is the moment that I was going to retire. And I looked at retiring and I found a functional area of acquisitions. And acquisitions is cost, schedule, and performance. If say the best way to think of this, and if anyone's listening, go watch Pentagon Wars. It's a movie. That's the best way to describe acquisitions. But if you want a new tank, You come to me and I go out to industry and I find the industry to build the tank, and I get it out to the soldier and we train them, and now the tank is being fielded. But I started to do another hard thing in life, is where I went to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And to this moment, I've never really took math, right? I had a criminal justice bachelor's degree. I went into the infantry. I always joke that I'm 1 degree away from eating crayons with our Marine counterparts out there. But the Army made a pivot of where they want STEM related acquisition officers. And I'm giggling to myself because I didn't even know what STEM was. I was like, okay, what does that mean? And I walk into my orientation and they're going through what the next 18 months is going to be for our master's program. And they keep throwing this word out, MS, 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 MS. And I was like, I wonder if that's like a new form of an MBA, because that's what I was supposed to be going to get. And nope, it's a master's in science and systems engineering management. And I look at them and I'm like, oh my God. Okay, so you're gonna make me take mathematics, and I've done everything in my life to avoid it like the plague. And that next 18 months was a whirlwind, but it was an amazing, humbling experience, because I pulled back a lot of memories that I had in Ranger School, where I was physically and mentally exhausted to the point where I didn't think I could carry on. Well, that was a different level of mental exhaustion and getting in my head, thinking that I couldn't do certain things. And I ended up graduating with, I think, a 3.96 GPA, and I had like 1B plus, and everything else was A's. And looking back on that, wow, how you can get in your mind and you can defeat yourself of just having such a negative outlook. And I was able to graduate. I was able to get my degree, and I went to my first duty station, which is where I'm currently at right now. And that's Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And while I was here, I had to lead people. And this was such a huge change that I did not influence. I had no authority over, and had vastly superior skills than me, and were vastly older than me. So everyone on my team was probably average age in their 50s, some were in their 60s, some were in their 40s, but that was the minority of them. All these people have advanced degrees in senior mathematics, or in masters in engineering, or doctorate degrees, or have over 25 years of experience in the government. And some of these people are retired colonels. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wow, how am I going to be able to lead these people? And what value am I going to add to these people? And then it kind of dawned on me, and this is where I was able to connect it all, is that leadership is my ability to gather people around a shared vision, around shared core values, and illuminate a path. Because that's all leadership is. Leadership is being a shepherd. It's taking people from point A to point B and letting them do the work, but keeping them in the confines of that bridge so they don't fall off or they veer off the rails, and getting them to point B. All a leader does is just take people along for the journey and inspire them along the way. And around that same time, I was looking at creating my own coaching business of a free service to the military. And that's really where it all started from. And almost divine interaction in a way is that the Army reached out and said that they're starting this new coaching program, the Army coaching program, of where they'll take you through a completely paid for International Coaching Federation coaching program, and that you only would have to give back 100 hours to the Army. And I was able to do that and go through it and really deep dive into myself of, hey, who I was, defining what a purposeful, accountable leader is. And what I define a purposeful, accountable leader, or a PAL, is a leader that I'm trying to create. It's someone who chooses the hard right over the easy wrong because it's the right thing to do. It's choosing the hard path, the path that's least taken. It's choosing to add value to people, not add value to yourself. And a great book, Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. And that's the beauty about it, is that a PAL eats last because it's the right thing to do. And I went through that program, and that's currently where I'm at right now. I started my podcast, and it all came down to this whole journey around a problem set that I set up is, how can I positively affect 1 million lives in the next 10 years, which would be the first time that I would even fathom about getting out of the military, because I love what I do. And I thought it was going to be able to teach financial freedom at first on this whole journey that I was going on. I thought it was going to be tailored more towards life coaching and mindset training. And then it dawned on me, all the way back to my grade school days, is that I've had one natural ability that I've been able to master and focus over the years, and that's leadership. And why do soldiers and service members have mental health issues? And I'm not saying it's all based on leadership, but I'm pretty sure that you could correlate most of these issues with poor leaders. And why do people get out of the military? It's because they had one bad leader. And that's all it takes. It just takes one bad leader that has transitional leadership practices to set a soldier down that path of darkness. And my whole goal for the next 10 years of my life is to be a light bringer, is to help people avoid that darkness and share with the world transformational stories and skills. And that's where I'm at right now. I do free coaching for anyone in the military. I do paid coaching for anyone who wants that in their lives. And I run my own podcast. So at a very long definition, that is who I am.
I think your story is absolutely incredible, Joshua. And it's been amazing just hearing how you've transformed as a leader from that, guy in a rural small town to who you are today. Well, a couple things that stood out to me. I mean, one of them, when you were going through Ranger School, how you said that you were really focusing on leading yourself, which I think is important. But it can be very easy to get caught up in just what you need and not that adding value aspect. And I think that's where a lot of leaders in the military get stuck, is it can be so easy to be that person that wants to chase an award and chase that good feeling. And there's nothing wrong with wanting an award or wanting the good feeling, but all in all, that can create this cycle of, where we become attached to an identity that surrounds a job. And that's where people really struggle when they are no longer attached to that job because it became their identity. A lot of what you said reminds me of David Goggins' story. I don't know if you've read his book, Can't Hurt Me, but he also talks about how in the beginning of, his leadership journey, there was a time period where he had to transition that mindset too. I think you'd enjoy that book a lot if you hadn't read it yet. But yeah, I'd love to just talk about, from the mental health aspect, how, as you were a newer leader and you're going on these combat deployments, how did you get people to still go about their day-to-day job when there's chaos around? People are getting killed in action, people are losing limbs, amputees. I mean, how did you deal with that mentally? And then how did you bring the team together so that everyone continued to move forward?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. And I kind of state, up front, that I was blessed from a standpoint of finishing the remainder of that 7-month deployment and never having a casualty. And I credit that to the ability of kind of working together as a team, but being able to heal, right? So when I took over that platoon, they deployed with 44 people. And when I took over, they had 28 people. And some of those people were volunteers from other organizations because we were so undermanned. From a mental health standpoint, what I learned is that, and I learned this in command too, is that you have to keep your mind busy. And the moment that you allow time, which you would think would be a good thing, to kind of creep in and give individuals back mental time, that's when little monsters start popping up, little monsters on your shoulder that tell you that you're not good enough, or that today's just going to be a bad day, and negativity sets in. So one of the biggest things that I tried to do when I was in command and when I was a platoon leader is to try to set up routines. And I remember when I first took over my platoon, after every combat mission, what would we do? We would watch this brand new show coming out, which was Game of Thrones. So that was the first season that it would come out, and we would always sit down as a team, and we would watch this after every patrol to kind of decompress. And this was in an era before we had cell phones and WhatsApp and all these MWR facilities where you could talk with your wife and your kids and your family and your friends back home. I would go 3 months at a time before I was able to talk with my wife, and all you had was your family. And I think when you're in those situations, it's easy to look past the chaos that's around you because you have such a deep connection to those that are with you in those moments, is that they're your brothers and they're your sisters. And it's always funny is that the humor in the infantry community, especially when the conditions begin to deteriorate, is always bright, is that you're always looking for the good because that we're just used to embracing discomfort. But I think the biggest issue in terms of mental health is once that environment's gone, when soldiers come back home from deployments or when soldiers exit out of the military, having those kinds of situations and those dependencies that you develop over time with other people. And then when you leave, how do you prevent that from happening? And I would say on a larger, to answer your question, larger is that you have to maintain fulfillment in life. And for me, fulfillment comes down to 3 P's. And I shared it on the podcast that you were on, is that we have to have a vision for our life or perspective. You have to be able to see through the mental fog. So the fog of war and the fog of life are the exact same thing. And it can disorient you, and you're not going to be able to move through it unless you have a clear aim in sight and you're able to push through that. And you have to understand what your passion is. What are you passionate about? Because that allows you to do hard things. If your why is big enough, you're not going to quit because it demands a response. And then your purpose. Why are you put on this earth? And in the military, it's easy for us to have a passion and it's easy for us to have a purpose. But the moment that you hang up your uniform, you have to discover who you are. And that's a lot of pressure on people of like, hey, who is Josh if I wasn't wearing the uniform? And that's a hard question for people to take on.
Yeah, that's awesome points there. I appreciate it. And I'm so excited for the episode that we recorded earlier today to come out, because I think that both these episodes are going to go very much hand in hand. And I think there's so many amazing leadership principles that you talk about that so many people that are serving currently or served in the past, or maybe are going to serve in the future, could take away. The military really isn't teaching leadership principles to people. And when you say that leadership and mental health go hand in hand, I 100% agree with you. You know, a lot of the darkest moments that I experienced when I was in the military, and I touched on this earlier today in our episode, a lot of that equated to bad leadership, to me not feeling like my voice was heard, or feeling like someone was trying to undermine what I was trying to do, no matter how much effort I put forth. Now, had I had the leadership training to know that, what someone else's opinion of me doesn't determine my worth, or vice versa, had they had that leadership training, then the situation might have been different. But I'm always grateful for my adversity because it created who I am today. And it sounds like from hearing your story, I mean, everything that's happened in your life has stacked on to create who you are today. And I thought it was incredible when you talked about how you had your life saved essentially at a young age from a tonsil surgery.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But it sounds like that was really like the foundation of what created who you are. And so I think it's really, really important to reflect on things like that.
I admire you, by the way, being able to do this with this, because I'm warning you, my son's going to run in. He's already done it several times today, just not with you. And how frustrating that makes me, but also at the time I think about it like, hey, this season of life will pass and I'm going to look back and I'm going to regret not being able to kind of soak up my son being at that age. So you being able to do this with your daughter is inspiring.
Thank you. Yeah. There was a point where I was, I took a little bit of time off of the podcast. I know we're kind of sidetracking here, but important points to bring up, right? About just going with the flow of things. I mean, I took probably a month off of recording and really reflected on how I was going to make this work and how I was going to optimize in my life being a new mom. And
Mm,
realizing that sometimes just showing up, whether it's perfect or not, is important too.
yeah.
And it's something that's been such a theme throughout my life over the last year is just showing up, whether it's perfect or not. And, showing up imperfect is better than not showing up at all. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's always great connecting with other podcasters, especially ones who have kids and understand too.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's a lot. So, but anyway, going back to what we were talking about earlier about leadership and mental health and everything combined, as you approach these new situations where you had to lead different groups of people, either younger soldiers or had to lead people that were maybe older than you or more experienced, was there ever a fear aspect, or was there ever a time that you doubted yourself and you were like, oh, I don't know if I can do this? Or do you feel that you always had pretty confident feelings headed into these situations?
Every time I take over a new role and a new position, I always have those little monsters that kind of jump on my shoulder and tell me, hey, you're not ready for this position. You have no idea what that system does. And then I go back to, okay, what are my strengths? Not my weaknesses. What are my strengths? How can I lean on those strengths to get me through those times? But answer the question another way is my house of leadership. I confidently understand who I am. And it was funny. We were doing an in brief with my new O6, and I gave her, hey, here's a who I am pamphlet. Here's my values that I measure in life. Here is my house of leadership, my leadership philosophy, all of these things. And I can confidently give it to her because that's what I live every single day. And for me, it comes down to my core values, and there's several core values that I have, but there's two acronyms, and it's RID RAD. So the first one is routine, accountability, and discipline. Is I'm routine in my actions, and one of the enduring qualities that I have with any role is my email title will always say, one of my favorite quotes from Aristotle: we are what we repetitively do. Excellence then isn't an act, it's a habit. So I use my power of having routines and accountability and extreme discipline to kind of help set up the team and orient them in the right way. And then another one is respect, integrity. I can't think of what, and I'll have to come back on the other one. I can't think of what it is right now, but respect and integrity of everyone, and duty, sorry, RID, is everyone on my team is going to have a voice regardless of who you are, because that's one of the beauties about leadership is the more diverse your team is, the more broader the pool of strengths are. And the more broader the pool of strengths are in your organization means the more collectively strong your organization will be. If everyone thinks like you, everyone looks like you, everyone dresses like you have a hollow workforce and you're not able to weather storms. And when a storm does come, you're going to crumble. And then integrity, do what you say you're going to do and don't violate your core values is, for me, do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal. And I would always tell the men and women that I led is that I love them like a family member. I remember my safety briefs is like, you guys are my family because I spend more time with you guys than my actual family. So I love you from that standpoint, but don't mistake my weakness or my kindness for weakness. If you violate my integrity of who I am, you will be crushed. And I think with that, of kind of having that mindset of clear boundaries as a leader, and then duty, understanding what I do is larger than myself and its significance. The position that I hold right now will be here 10 years. I may not be. And having that understanding is that leadership's a journey. It's not a destination. And where I'm at right now does not mean I've arrived. In 10 years, when I make colonel or lieutenant colonel, does not mean I've arrived. It just means that's a season of leadership that I'm at. And leadership for me is a bridge. I see it as like an actual fundamental bridge with 6 distinct phases. So another very long answer to your short question.
I appreciate that. And so, from like a scenario based standpoint, have you ever approached a situation where you were assigned to lead a group of people and they were very resistant to change, or they had been doing something a certain way for so long that they didn't want to be open to hearing new things? And How did you handle that? What advice would you give to someone that is a leader that is approaching a situation like that? Because I think it's very relevant when we're talking about the military.
I think one of the most important things to do is strengthening relationships, right? So the way I see leadership is it comes in six distinct phases. And to kind of answer your question is it happens between the second and the third phase. So first phase of leadership is self. You have to master yourself before you can master other people. And then you have to learn what situational leadership is, the second phase of leadership, of where you take over a position. That's where you're learning what your job, your scope is. And then the third phase of leadership is strengthening relationships and building authentic relationships and trust and earning respect. For me, the job that I'm currently in right now, I probably had the most resistance to change. In the military, from my standpoint, and I always had the mentality of it's the 90-day rule that the Army has, that you have 90 days to come into an organization and evaluate and then make the changes and then see where that landed with a command survey. For me, I was always under the mindset is that's hot poopy garbage. Is that if I know something's wrong and I know there's a better way to do it, I'm going to rip the Band-Aid off and I'm going to do it right away. And you probably will not like me for that, but you will respect me. And the results will speak for itself because we're going to get to that destination quicker. And for me, the job that I'm in right now, the last person that was in this role was a phenomenal officer, but a little bit inexperienced from the standpoint of not understanding kind of what priorities should be set. And when I came in, I saw a lot of glaring holes because I was blessed to be in a position before of a similar role. So I knew what priorities should be set, what kind of metrics should be tracked in terms of logistics and all these different things. And having routine meetings was part of that. Being communicating and then collaborating with people was the most important thing. And there was so much hesitation against everyone on the team is that we don't have the time to have all these meetings. Why are we doing it? But I was looking from an aerial view. I pulled myself outside of the tactical view of where everyone's on the ground and everything's on fire and they're just running around. They're just putting everything out because everything is on fire. And I pulled myself in an aerial perspective and I looked at it from the lens is that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. We have to create routine events. And in those routine events is where we solve problems. If we have our weekly sync meeting, we have our business sync meeting, we have our test sync meeting, we have our logistics sync meeting. And when an issue arises, we already have a time to meet. One of the most challenging things that I had to learn is that if you don't plan out your day as a leader, someone else is going to plan it for you. And that's probably one of the biggest advice that I would have is that when you come in and you run into a lot of friction, especially with a new team or organization, I guess it would be two things is rip the Band-Aid off. If you know there's a better way of doing something, the idea of what got you here won't get you there is false. And the status quo is the old way of doing it. And there's always a better way. And it kind of goes back to the rule of 3 C's, remain coachable, committed, and curious, is that you have to have a curious, open mindset or you're never going to continue to grow. And the second one is plan out your day. If you cannot plan out your day, especially when you're coming into a new team and be able to articulate that to people, then you're going to quickly find yourself underwater.
I love those examples. And I think they're very, very actionable steps that people can take. I actually had a leader that, ripped off the Band-Aid when I was serving. He was a chief of mine. And I've talked about him in several episodes, but one of the first things he did was he made a huge disruption when he first took over that position because his philosophy was, if I make a huge disruption in the beginning, everything else from here is going to be a minor change. So,
absolutely.
And the disruption wasn't anything crazy. It was like taking a couch out of the workspace. Like it wasn't anything insane. Yeah. But people had an attachment to this stuff because things had been a certain way for so long that people were very upset. And, and that tends to happen in organizations and, things that have ran a certain way for so long. And so I love that you have these actionable examples that people can take and use and start implementing right away to become better leaders within their organization, or to at least start taking the steps to become a better leader, because it's not something that happens overnight. And then I love that you also provide support from a coaching standpoint for anyone that maybe would want to become a better leader and doesn't understand quite where to start or where to go, or maybe needs accountability. That being said, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you, or maybe they want to support your podcast?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to find me is my website. So you can go to McMillionLeadershipCoaching.com. My blog that I write every month is on there. The link to my podcast is on there, and all my social media links are on there. But really, where I try to pour myself into is my blogs and my podcast. So I release one blog a month. I'm not a big fan of doing like these small blogs every week. I try to write a pretty good blog every month that will help you on certain things. And where I'm at right now is kind of defining the 6 phases of leadership and then providing you ways that you can win and lose at each phase. So if you wanted to find me, that's the easiest way. And my podcast is called Tales of Leadership, and it can be found on any platform that you want to listen to. So Spotify, wherever have you. It's through Buzzsprout, and I think they have it on like 16 different platforms or something now. So I can be found pretty easy.
Awesome. Yeah, I know. I don't even know half the podcasting platforms out there. I just know your basics like Apple, Spotify. But I'll make sure to link everything in the show notes for anyone that wants to check out the website or the podcast and support. And please do make sure you go from one podcaster to another. Go listen to his podcast, rate and review it, share it with your audience, because it will give value to other people. And I think that's the biggest thing about these platforms, right, is sharing that value with other people. And you never know who needs to hear something like that. There's a lot of information out there, especially when it comes to leadership, and sometimes condensing it to a podcast platform or something that's a little more digestible is easier for people. So if you're listening to this episode, go check out, support his episode. Go listen to my episode with him that we recorded, and share with your audience. So last thing, Joshua, to end off the episode for today, is there any advice or anything you want to leave the audience with?
The biggest thing that I want to leave everyone with is my definition of leadership. And it's easy. It's just one word. A leader inspires. And that is what a true leader does. That's what a purposeful, accountable leader does. They provide purpose, direction, and motivation, and they inspire people along the way. So, Rachel, it's been an absolute honor and a privilege to get to talk to you again, but also be a guest on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those words, and thank you for sharing your incredible story. I hope people take the opportunity to reach out to you to support what you're doing, and I look forward to watching you grow. Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.